What if I told you that Hawaii's most iconic snack food was built from a canned meat product the US military shipped to the islands by the millions during World War II, and that the state now consumes roughly 7 million tins of it every single year, more per capita than anywhere else in the country? That the format of an entire genre of Hawaiian meal, rice, macaroni salad, a hunk of meat, all in one foam container, was never invented by a single chef in a single restaurant, but assembled gradually over decades as plantation workers from 5 different countries traded food out of their lunch pails in the same sugarcane fields. That a chicken dish now sold at roadside stands across the islands, famous enough to fund millions of dollars in school and church fundraisers, traces to one specific 1955 afternoon when a poultry company co-founder grilled his mother's teriyaki recipe for a group of farmers and never wrote the sauce recipe down? Honolulu, where the plantation lunch line became the whole identity of the table. Spam arrived in Hawaii by accident of geography and war. The U.S. military's enormous presence on Oahu, especially after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, meant a constant supply chain of shelf-stable canned meat moving through the islands to feed troops. And Spam, introduced by Hormel in 1937, was the most efficient of those options. Salty, fatty, capable of sitting unrefrigerated for months. It became normalized in island households simply through sheer repetition. What happened next is genuinely disputed, and Hawaii has never fully settled the question. The most commonly cited inventor is Barbara Funamura, a Japanese-American entrepreneur on Kauai, who, by the early 1980s, was selling Spam musubi out of her restaurant Joni Hana in the Kukui Grove Center. Described by a 1983 newspaper as Spam and rice, 2 local favorites, combined in an enormous musubi wrapped in nori. Funamura eventually began shaping her musubi with a box mold, locking in the rectangular form everyone now recognizes. But Honolulu has its own competing claimant, Mitsuko Kaneshiro, who began selling the same combination out of City Pharmacy on Pensacola Street, and by the early 1980s was hand-making and selling roughly 500 Spam musubi a day from her own shop, Michan's Musubi. The Honolulu Star Bulletin, writing about the dish in 2002, put it plainly. There is no definitive history for this aberration. Some origin stories push the timeline back even further, to Japanese-American internment camps on the mainland, where prisoners reportedly improvised a precursor by laying seasoned Spam slices over rice in a baking pan, working with the limited foods available to them. The format itself borrows directly from onigiri. The Japanese rice ball wrapped in nori, that plantation-era Japanese immigrants had already been making for their own field lunches for decades. Spam simply replaced the pickled plum or fish, filling with whatever canned protein the war had made universally available. Today, Spam musubi sits by convenience store cash registers across every island, sold in formal restaurants and 7-Eleven counters alike, and the 1999 mainland expansion of L&L Hawaiian barbecue carried it into the continental United States as a defining regional snack. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, sugar and pineapple plantation owners recruited laborers from Japan, China, Korea, the Philippines, and Portugal to work the fields side by side. And at lunch, those workers sat together and opened their bento boxes and tin pails in the same row. A Japanese worker traded rice for a Filipino worker's adobo. A Portuguese family's sausage ended up beside a Chinese family's char siu. Over decades of this daily, unplanned cultural exchange, the shared meal slowly standardized into a recognizable format. A generous scoop of protein, 2 scoops of sticky white rice, and a scoop of creamy macaroni salad. The specific combination that local food historian Cowie Philpotts describes as requiring an ice cream scoop, that's critical. And, just as critically, no vegetables at all. After the plantation era wound down, lunch wagons that had been feeding stevedores and construction workers since the 1930s kept the format alive, and a wave of post-World War II diners and drive-ins, Grace's Inn, Like Drive-In, James's Fountain, Rainbow Drive-In, which opened in Kapahulu in 1961 and still draws lines today, turned the plantation workers' improvised lunch tin into Hawaii's defining civilian meal. The plate lunch is the one dish on this list that nobody invented on purpose. In 1954, a former World War II naval intelligence officer named Ernest Morgado partnered with a chicken farmer named Mike Asagi to found the Pacific Poultry Company in Ewa, on Oahu. The following year, at a meeting with local farmers, the two men barbecued chicken using a glaze based on Morgado's mother's own teriyaki-style recipe. Soy sauce, brown sugar, and pineapple juice, brushed onto chicken roasting on a makeshift spit over open coals. The chicken needed to be turned constantly to cook evenly and caramelize without burning, and onlookers at the farmers' gathering started shouting huli, the Hawaiian word for turn, every time the birds needed flipping. The name stuck immediately, doubled for emphasis, huli-huli. The dish's popularity exploded specifically because of how well it worked as a fundraising tool. According to Morgado's stepson, huli-huli chicken sales at church fundraisers, school events, and softball team bake sales have collectively raised millions of dollars for Hawaiian community causes over the decades since 1955. A single farmer's gathering glaze recipe becoming one of the island's most effective grassroots financing tools. Morgado himself never released his exact sauce formula before his death, and chefs across the islands have spent decades reverse engineering approximations using pineapple juice, soy sauce, ginger, garlic, and brown sugar, never quite certain whether they've actually matched the original. Loco Moco's most cited origin traces to the Lincoln Grill in Hilo, on the Big Island, sometime in the late 1940s. Local teenagers, according to the most repeated version of the story, asked the owner for something fast, filling, and cheap, and got back a hamburger patty over white rice, smothered in brown gravy, topped with a fried egg. While the dish's birthplace sits on the Big Island rather than Oahu, Honolulu adopted and scaled loco moco into one of the city's most ubiquitous comfort foods, appearing on plate lunch counters, in upscale brunch reinventions, and on McDonald's Hawaii menus, where the combination has been sold as a permanent regional item since the 1970s. The gravy-soaked rice, the runny egg yolk breaking over the patty, and the sheer caloric density of the dish made it an immediate hit with the same plantation-descended, working-class clientele that the plate lunch format had already been built to serve. Saimin exists nowhere outside Hawaii, despite looking, at first glance, like it should exist everywhere. It's a noodle soup built from Japanese dashi broth, Chinese-style egg noodles, and a topping combination, char siu, spam, kamaboko fish cake, green onion, that no single immigrant culture brought to the islands intact. It was assembled, piece by piece, inside plantation labor camps where Japanese, Chinese, Filipino, and Korean workers were cooking in close enough proximity that ingredient swapping became inevitable. The dish became so deeply normalized in Hawaiian daily life that McDonald's locations across the islands have sold their own version of Saimin for decades, a detail locals frequently cite as proof of exactly how essential the soup is to the regional identity. Since McDonald's almost never customizes its core menu this dramatically for a single regional market anywhere else in the country. Honolulu's Saimin stands and plate lunch counters serve it as a cheap, fast, late-night staple, the noodle soup equivalent of the plate lunch's meat-rice macaroni formula. Nobody owns it, and everybody eats it. Long before poke became a mainland lunch counter trend served in disposable bowls with quinoa and edamame, it was simply the Hawaiian way of preparing freshly caught fish. Raw fish, traditionally inamona, roasted, ground kukui nut, combined with sea salt, seaweed, and whatever else was on hand, eaten almost immediately after the catch. The word poke itself means to slice, or cut crosswise, in Hawaiian, describing nothing more elaborate than the technique of cubing the fish. Honolulu's fish markets and grocery store poke counters, particularly the deli cases at Foodland, and the dedicated poke shops that have proliferated across the city in the last 2 decades, now sell dozens of variations. Shoyu poke with sesame oil and green onion, spicy ahi poke with sriracha mayo, and increasingly elaborate combinations built for a mainland market that discovered the dish only recently and turned it into a national fast casual category, largely stripped of the specific Hawaiian context, the inamona, the seaweed, the particular relationship to a freshly landed catch that originally defined it. Portuguese immigrants began arriving in Hawaii in significant numbers starting in 1878, recruited specifically to work the sugar plantations, and they brought with them a Lenten pastry tradition. Malasadas, a deep-fried, egg-rich dough, similar to a donut but without the hole, rolled in granulated sugar immediately after frying while still hot. Leonard's Bakery, opened in Honolulu's Kaimuki neighborhood in 1952 by Leonard Rego, became, and remains, the city's defining malasada institution, frying them fresh throughout the day and selling them by the dozen to a line that rarely shortens regardless of hour. The malasada's transition from a specific Portuguese Catholic pre-Lenten treat into an everyday, all-occasion Honolulu snack mirrors the same pattern as nearly everything else on this list. An immigrant tradition, stripped of its original calendar restriction, absorbed into the daily rhythm of island life until it belonged to everyone. Chinese immigrants introduced this dish to Hawaii in the 19th century, and it has remained close enough to its original form that the Hawaiian adaptation is barely distinguishable from dishes found across parts of mainland China. Chicken, simmered with ginger, garlic, and onion until the broth turns golden and deeply aromatic, served with long rice, which despite the name contains no rice whatsoever. Long rice refers to bean thread noodles, thin, translucent glass noodles made from mung bean starch that stretch out long and clear in the bowl, giving the dish its name through pure visual resemblance rather than any actual ingredient overlap. It's a fixture at Hawaiian luau specifically, served alongside laulau and kalua pork, as one of the dishes meant to represent the island's broader, multi-ethnic culinary identity to visitors experiencing a luau for the first time, even though its roots are entirely Chinese rather than native Hawaiian. Alongside malasadas, Portuguese plantation workers brought a hearty tomato-based soup built from Portuguese sausage, kidney beans, potatoes, and cabbage, a dish designed to stretch a small amount of meat across an entire family's dinner using whatever vegetables a plantation worker's garden plot could produce. The soup became and remains a rainy day staple across Honolulu households, regardless of ethnic background, served with rice or fresh bread depending on the family. It sits in the same category as the chicken long rice and the Saimin, an immigrant dish that arrived fully formed from a specific culture's homeland tradition, then settled into general island use without losing its name or its essential identity, unlike the plate lunch or Saimin, which required multiple cultures colliding before the dish could exist at all. Along Oahu's north shore, shrimp trucks parked along the highway turned a simple preparation. Fresh shrimp, sautéed in a genuinely startling quantity of butter and garlic, served over rice, into a specific culinary destination in its own right, drawing visitors who will drive well out of their way, specifically for the pooled garlic butter soaking into the rice beneath the shrimp. The dish traces to the aquaculture shrimp farms that developed along the North Shore, and the trucks that sprang up to sell the harvest directly roadside became as much a part of the North Shore's identity as its famous surf breaks. Garlic shrimp occupies a different category from the rest of this list. It's not a plantation-era survival dish or an immigrant tradition repackaged for island life, but a genuinely modern Honolulu area food, built specifically around fresh local aquaculture and a captive audience of beachgoers willing to wait in a roadside line for a plate that's mostly butter. Honolulu's food was never built by a single chef working in a single kitchen toward a single vision. It was built field by field, lunch tin by lunch tin, by Japanese, Chinese, Korean, Filipino, and Portuguese workers who had no real choice about working side by side on the same plantations, and who, out of that forced proximity, created an entire regional cuisine almost by accident. Nobody can say for certain whether Spam musubi belongs to Kauai's Barbara Funamura or Honolulu's Mitsuko Kaneshiro, and after 40 years, nobody has settled it. The plate lunch wasn't invented. It accumulated, one shared bento box at a time, until rice and macaroni salad and a scoop of meat became as fixed a formula as a sandwich. Huli-huli chicken exists because one man's mother's teriyaki recipe happened to get cooked for a crowd of farmers on exactly the right afternoon in 1955, and he never wrote down how he made it. Not every city has two separate, fiercely defended creation myths for its single most iconic snack food. Not every city's defining meal format was built collaboratively by 5 immigrant cultures who never formally agreed on what they were creating. Not every city eats 7 million cans of a World War II surplus meat product every single year and calls it comfort food.